All right, welcome back, everybody, to the Through Help and Back podcast. It is a wonderful Labor Day weekend here in New Hampshire. We are feeling awesome. We're in a good mood. It is me and producer Ian in the studio today. We have an amazing guest for you that I'm going to bring in here in a second. But he's not with us here physically. He's here with us in spirit and heart and mind and all that good stuff. But we are loving life right now. As everybody knows, it's getting into fall in New England, and that's kind of the best time of year up here. And Ian, the leafers will be here soon, so the roads are going to be clogged up and all of our parks are going to be congested, and that's not going to be so great, but we'll survive that. We're feeling awesome. College football started. The Buckeyes won. Most of you know I'm from Ohio originally, so cheering hard for the Ohio State Buckeyes, and they had a big win over Notre Dame, and it's exciting. I mean, it's a win over a mid-major, but we're still proud of it. Notre Dame's not, it's not like an Alabama or Georgia, but good enough. We'll go for it. We'll take the win to start the season, and things are going good. So I always like to take a little time at the beginning to remind everybody that this podcast is sponsored by 𝐬𝐚 Behavioral Health. 𝐬𝐚 Behavioral Health, really simply put, is an outpatient substance abuse and mental health services provider. Multiple locations. We're growing fast. We're in Ohio. We're in New Hampshire. Opening several new locations in Ohio here very soon. Looking at our third location, already open here in New Hampshire. Plans for a fourth and fifth. So if you're somebody in that area, either state, I mean, you don't have to be, next door to one of our offices. The telehealth world has changed things, and you're somebody who's looking for any kind of help, or you have a loved one who's looking for any kind of help dealing with drug issues, substance abuse issues, mental health, depression, anxiety, anything like that. 𝐬𝐚 Behavioral Health is kind of a new kind of company. They are clinician owned and clinician operated, which to folks who are sort of shopping for care, that may not mean a whole lot at the beginning, but it does make a big difference when the people who are calling the shots and the people who are making the decisions are clinicians themselves. So it's a very provider-friendly, client-first organization. And actually, our guest today is associated with 𝐬𝐚 Behavioral Health. It is the Director of Clinical Operations, Dr. Casey Montoya. He is joining us today. Casey, how are you doing, sir?
Good. How are you been?
I'm good. So I was a little jealous. I was talking about the Buckeyes. You were in Ohio, so you're probably enjoying that this weekend, and everybody's feeling good there. Oh, little representation, yeah. Little representation, so that's good. So Casey is based out of our Mount Vernon location, but he absolutely keeps an eye on all clinical operations statewide, and actually helps us out in New Hampshire as well. So we have a visit coming pretty soon. I mean, we're getting excited for that. So ready to brave the New England weather. It's good today, but it may be rainy by the time you get there, maybe cold by the time you leave, and then warm again. So we're looking forward to having you, though.
Yeah, no, that's exciting. I know you mentioned the weather. I think it was on Friday. You're like, it was 49. I was like, ooh, okay, that's a little chill for me.
Casey's going to have the culture shock of seeing these houses without air conditioning in them. And I mean, not mine, but some of the houses, for sure, it's an adjustment because you just don't really need it like you used to. And actually, some of the schools around here actually don't even have air conditioning. So like you start school, it's crazy. And they're also very old buildings. So, part of the reason we had Casey on, he's got an upcoming visit. He does such a great job for us looking at our clinical operations side. But one of our recent episodes was focused on solution-focused therapy. And we got a lot of questions, had a lot of great response about that, people wanting to know more about it, wanting to know some of the roots and the basis of that. And Casey comes from a very strength-based, sort of positive psychology focus, not only in his leadership, but in his primary practice work as well. So we're really excited to have you on, Casey, and help expand on that issue and talk solutions with us. And we'll just dig in and see what you have to share. So we always lead off and kind of kick off with some articles, just kind of what's going on in the world around us in terms of mental health. And so keeping with that solution focused theme, I pulled our crack research staff, I guess that'd be Ian and myself. We pulled some articles that I'll share. So the first one's from Psychology Today, and they're kind of investigating a strength-based approach, primarily with helping children. Casey, I know a lot of your work has been with adolescents and children, especially in the middle of Ohio there. There's been a huge demand since the pandemic, so probably something that you've run into quite a bit. But what I thought was interesting about it, beyond the basics of, kind of explaining their approach and why they think that's a good idea for children is they talked a lot about in this article about the medical model or disease model as kind of a metaphor for traditional therapy versus positive psychology and solution-focused therapy. So in kind of a medical model, you're identifying a problem, cancer being like an obvious example. We found the tumor, you cut it out, you'd make whatever changes to the system that you need to make to help it function effectively again, and life is good, right? Well, what they posit is that kind of therapy kind of followed that medical model, outline where it's like, let's find the problem, let's get the proper diagnosis, and from proper problem identification, best diagnosis, comprehensive assessment. If we really know a lot about the problem, that'll best prepare us for finding a solution. And what they found is actually working with children, it's kind of been the opposite. They've had a lot more success instead of asking what's wrong, kind of asking what's working well, what's right. So is that something that I see you nodding a little bit, Casey. Is that something you've seen in your practice? I mean, does that make sense to you and some of the work that you've done as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's not just the therapy world, but just anytime you panel off any insurance, there's medical necessity, that golden thread, right? And so there's always the problem. What's the problem? Depression, anxiety, and then you'll dig through it. This as well as I do. The biopsychosocial or our assessments that we have to process with our clients are 13, 14, 15 pages long. And a lot of that is because we want to know every single problem to throw it into that medical necessity. But then just kind of flowing right back to your point is the solution focus side is going to look at, okay, you may have all these problems because we do have to assess for all those. We have to make sure that we have that documented, but our clients have the ability to prioritize those problems and what's for you, and using that word instead. So instead of focusing on the problem, how are we going to make it work for you, right? Or what do we got to do to overcome those problems?
Yeah, and when you mentioned that, I want to back up a little bit. So when you mentioned things like, the diagnostic assessment flowing into the golden thread. So if somebody's listening to that, they're in therapy, the golden thread is happening for you behind the scenes. I promise you don't know what that is, but can you give us kind of a 101, kind of walk us through what that concept is and how it applies to our work?
Yeah, you started it just with you have cancer, here's the treatment. So it's the same concept in therapy. We have to prove that something is wrong with you. So typically that's through the diagnostic assessment. So we're going to get a depression or anxiety, maybe both, or substance use. So we have that primary diagnosis. So if we kind of equate it to like the medical model, we can say depression, and then you come in for a broken bone. Well, you can potentially have a broken bone, but you have to test for it or assess for it, get an x-ray, and that's the diagnostic assessment. From there, we have to do a treatment plan. And so that treatment plan needs to include goals and objectives to help overcome that problem. So for the broken bone would be the treatment plan will say, you're going to get a cast, you're going to have, ibuprofen or whatever the case is, and you need to not use your arm for 6 weeks and then come back. On the therapy side, that treatment plan is going to include things like therapy, CBT, solution focused, strengths-based approaches. And then from there, the documentation that goes along with it. So the follow-up appointments for the arm might be PT. You're going and you're doing all those pieces and then doing your follow-ups with your doctor, your orthopedic doctor, if that's the case. And then for us, it's the documentation we do after each session.
It's that's one of the cruel tricks that they play on young counselors who are going through school. I know they played that trick on me, where you go in and you want to help people. And you see things in movies and you want to just talk to people and have these sort of healing therapeutic conversations. And, what I was taught was that half the job is documenting the job, right? So if you have the greatest session ever, enlightening to everybody, life-changing, and you don't document it, you get a 50%, which is an F, right? Because it didn't happen, right? I think people... I don't know why you would know. We didn't know, right, till it was too late, what the documentation requirements really are to this kind of stuff. So
but the movies don't show that. Like for me, Robin Williams and seeing him in therapy, and like I look at that movie later, Good Will Hunting. not once did you see him writing anything down or behind a computer screen, staying up late, catching up on his notes. Like that wasn't a piece. It was just, it's not your fault. It's not your fault.
Client acknowledged understanding that it was no longer his fault for previous traumas and verbalized. Yeah. It makes it less romantic, right? For sure. If you're watching that kind of stuff. So, but that's good. And that's a good explanation of that. It's interesting because it's not something we planned on talking about, but in traditional medicine, we know that if you cast a broken bone for X amount of weeks, you have a 95% chance of that bone being healed, right? It's why the doctor says come back in 6 weeks or 8 weeks or whatever. And we can do a bone density scan and, understand whether or not. How do you, we've all got our own strategies around this, but how do you formulate that treatment plan? How do you build that plan for somebody's care, whether it be in a solution-focused context or not, with a science that I've said it several times is more art than science, right? It's like a hard art, not a soft science. There's more art to this, and it's not dose dependent. You can have 9 sessions and feel like you're not getting anywhere with a client, and the next 3 are like, oh my God, like complete, life-changing light bulb catharsis, So how do you structure that, Casey? Like what resources do you rely on, or how do you kind of conceptualize a plan for a client when there's really not much of a way to reliably or predict, in 6 sessions, I think you're going to be fine, So how do you approach that? It's a challenge for sure.
For me, the start of therapy, really it's that building that rapport, building that therapeutic relationship, right? So you can kind of look at those two separately. Rapport gets built on that day one. So we're doing the assessment. So if I can put on a good face and show them, hey, I genuinely care while asking them, 122 questions, to get them to come back. So if they can like me day one, great, you'll come back for that first session. Then that's where I can start to work on the therapeutic rapport. So my process with that is I'm not hitting them right away. I'll ask them early on just so I can build that treatment plan and see what it's going to look like. But what do you hope to get out of us, right? What do you want for this to happen? So we don't have to jump fully into it, but I'll utilize supportive therapy really, really early. And so really taking like analogy of a sinking boat, right? Supportive therapy can come in and help just plug holes and keep it afloat, right? Get them through their crisis, get them through their extreme moments that they're having so that we can potentially get to more work. Because I could sit here, anybody that's felt any mode of stress knows you're probably not thinking very clear most times. So why would I expect that of my clients to say, hey, all right, day one, your anxiety's out the roof. I ask you why you're here and you say, oh, my anxiety, blah, 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 blah. And you're like, okay, well, cool. Well, let's talk about your treatment options and see, do you want to do EMDR? Do you want to do CBT, DBT, right? We could list the whole thing and they're just going to freak out and not be able to make a choice, right? One of the most common symptoms is, confusion, racing thoughts, that type of stuff that they're going to experience. So treatment planning is not going to happen day one, maybe even session 2 or 3. So that supportive therapy, build the rapport, get those points across, and you can add a little bit of psychoeducation just to get them to help set themselves up a little bit higher. And that's kind of how I start to flow. So usually about 2, 3, just depending on the client, 2, 3, maybe even 4 sessions in is when I'll really dig into that treatment plan and start using a little bit more strengths-based approach, maybe solution focused, just depending on the client. But because today is solution focused and strengths-based, we'll stick to that. But if we're on that, we'll go back to those questions. That big miracle question, you could wave a wand or open a door, walk through it, and tomorrow is the greatest day of your life. Everything is perfect. All your problems are gone. What would it look like? And, they can embellish from there.
They let you walk through the door. They were so adamant with me. You had to bring in the magic wand. They were like so strict on the Milwaukee, like 𝐷eShazor, Berg, like the magic wand has to be there. So it just gets in there automatically.
So my magic wand, that's what I used to always go to. Before we started, we were talking a little bit about like differences. Columbus, a little more open. right? City up here, a lot of the gentlemen that I was working with did not like the magic.
They don't want the magic wand.
metaphor.
Yeah. Yep.
So
I'm not a princess. Yeah.
Yeah, pretty much. Had a few Harry Potter fans, so that's, they could attune to that. But some are like, what magic wand, right? This is not, it's not fairy time. It's
well, and it all works. I think that's what's beautiful about our field and our practice, and that's why I just keep calling it a healing art, because you can make those changes, right? I mean, like, you think about a beautiful painting, and well, I would have gone with blue, and you went with green, and I would have done the shading this way, but it comes out in two different ways, and it impacts people in a different way. And so I think it's great. I think that's the magic to what we do. But I think it's really hard in a fee-for-service world where you have insurances calling you every month and saying, hey, he's had 4 sessions. Is he about done? Let's get him out of here. And you have to play the terminology game and say, well, he's doing better, but not so much better that, so you're kind of constantly balancing that. But to kind of close the book on this article with the schools and the kiddos, I mean, this, but folks at home may not. They did a lot of research, and they found, a lot of evidence that working with strengths with children worked well and showed positive outcomes for twice exceptional students. So those are students who are gifted, but also have learning or processing emotional developmental challenges. They also found it worked with children with ADD, ADHD, Asperger's, autistic spectrum, dyslexia, dysgraphia, again, sensory processing issues. So I think I really wanted to share that. And I think that's important because sometimes when we're dealing with a solution focused or positive psychology, it feels almost too easy or too simple, right? And I think what I've said before, it's like an easy thing to do, but it's a very difficult thing to do well, And so you can get a couple things. You can learn how to do a miracle question. You can say, what's been better? How'd you do that? So I just think it's important that people who are listening to this know across a wide range of what we would consider like big issues, the solution focused and strength based stuff has shown some like really significant outcomes and has shown some really significant positive impact there. So tell me a little bit about, we're going to dig into positive psych and solution focus, which are kind of like partner approaches. One can undergird the other. One's kind of a foundational belief where others the execution, whatever. But they play well together for sure. How did you first become interested, and what drew you to those, modalities or those approaches to therapy?
So early on, right, CBT, everybody always talks about, but when I was growing up as a therapist, I had a great mentor or a supervisor who was CBT trained. And so like I got a good piece of that in this very rigid and linear, process for therapy, which is great. And it's wonderful, especially early on. But it just it got to a point of almost robotic, and you can't always, like somebody with schizophrenia, that's not going to work off the bat. And so that's where a lot of my clients started coming in. And so when I was in my master's program, I took a course on strength space. Like was the course of it. So solution focus was in there. Narrative therapy, and then some like cognitive processing, motivational interviewing was all part of this course. So that's how I got jumped into it, was from there.
What was the, for people, just kind of some of the terminology games. So, CBT being cognitive behavioral therapy, definitely an execution based, right? You're sort of like, these are your cognitive distortions. We're going to work on this. We're going to journal. We're going to identify. I mean, there are some really nice executable steps to that approach, which I think is a great benefit, especially to an earlier therapist. And it's something you can use for your entire career. I mean, there are people who are 20, 30 years in, swear by CBT, and it feels concrete. And again, all the colors work. All the colors in the palette have a role. But I think that liberation to like, hey, there's more nuance, I guess, more touch and go, more kind of playing off of your client a little bit. That's what really drew me into it. But so I'm thinking back to your master's classes. You're kind of trained in this more direct, kind of like rigid style. You're in the solution focused class. You're getting these different modalities. So what was the light bulb that kind of went off? Like, oh, I like this because. Like what really worked for you at that time?
It was a miracle question.
Yeah.
Right. And taking a step back and be like, when, going back to your past, when did it work for you? Like those two questions, just I was like, oh, and it's oddly like counterintuitive to what most of us go through as therapists. Like, you don't give suggestions, you don't do this. And we have it's a little bit of misconception with solution folks. Like, that's what it feels like when in reality, you're evoking the solutions from the client, but you're kind of driving the path, right? And helping guide them to the solutions that are potentially going to help and work.
Yeah. The phrase we heard was leading from a step behind, right? So it's like the hand on the small of the back, or the hand on the back of the bicycle. You're not steering, but you're stabilizing, because it was so funny. We would go round and round with our professors about that. They're like, it's completely client focused. And we'd be like, yeah, but we're the ones that say, wow. Like, we're the ones that go, oh, that's interesting. Or tell me more about that. So we do draw attention to certain things. So more guardrails than anything else. So in your practice today, you're more kind of on the leadership side with the new, but in sort of recent clients and patients, what is your typical population or that you've been most experienced with, and how has that solution focused approach help you with those specific populations?
So it's, I've had a pretty eclectic group of clients here with a new dual diagnosis, some severe mental health, lots of trauma. So I'm trained in trauma as well. So really, the solution portions came to early on, especially with clients with the dual diagnosis, because they come in dual diagnosis. So we have, if we go back to that medical model, there's two problems. We have a substance use issue going on, and we have a mental health problem going on. And then on top of that, the clients that we were seeing were typically in some form of a rehab. And so that, 24/7 care, that, people around to help support them, but that just because they were supported didn't mean that they had everything worked out in their head, right? That they were still worried about finances. They're still worried about their family. They're still worried about their kids. So just because it's, depression and alcohol, right, doesn't mean that's all it was. So being able to take that step back and just kind of talk and build that rapport, and then finally get to that point of asking, hey, what do you hope to get from this, right? What do you want me to be working on with you? And then once they answer, it could be, I don't want to be alone anymore, or I want to be able to go to work and keep my job. Okay. And then we hit them with those questions. What does that look like? How's that happened for you before? What have you been doing when you've held a job for a year? And so we're just driving those home. So that's that population. Children has been another population I got to jump into a lot. That's a little bit different using the strength base, because usually the kids come in, they're not getting, there's some littles, quite a few littles, but those kids, usually happy-go-lucky in the moment, because there's that little bit of honeymoon phase that occurs. But parents are coming, they're bringing them in because they're done. So the kids typically don't have any more strengths at that point to them and in their perspective. So a lot of that is a little bit more what I would do with like some family work and building the rapport with the family and start to learn more about the kid to try to identify some strengths, right? Like there's one young man I can think about in particular, hilarious, just off the rip, like almost like kids say the darndest thing type of stuff. But we could use that and we could flip that. So he wasn't a kid who was just having outbursts at school, and his outbursts were really vocal, right? Which plays into his strength of being funny. And I believe he was 6 or 7 at the time. So he was definitely a little bit more advanced in his speech than his peers. And so I think that had a piece of it and played to it. But how do we do that? How do we get those? So we ended up working with case management and flipping that and using that to his advantage. So he got to present in class. And so that was how he went through. Yeah. So that's how he got to give his assignments or whatever the case was, which I think that's strengths based. That's purest right there.
Yeah. Yeah. He won't stop talking. So let's put him in a productive situation where talking would help him and others around him, right? And so you mentioned working with people in rehab. A lot of times we would talk about, what great business owners they would be, right? Because if they were dealing on the streets or whatever, it's like, or they're managing finite resources, right? Because folks who are in the throes of addiction are not, they typically don't have a lot of extra resources. All their money goes to their habit or concealing or using. And it's like, wow, you managed a small corporation, all by yourself, right? With no training. Imagine how you could apply those exact same skills, right? Because they would say, like, I knew I could get it from this guy for this amount. I knew I could get this money the following ways. I'd get this on Tuesday. I'd do it on Wednesday. I'm like, that's like a shipping and receiving, like import export business right there, And I think when you can reserve that judgment against like bad kid or bad person and just go like, wow, what do we have here that we can actually utilize, And that was the Milton Erickson thing, was utilization. It's like he had a mental patient who thought he was Jesus. And so he had him build a fence because Jesus was a carpenter, right? And by the time he built a fence around, this is back in the day when you could do stuff like that, right? And I think he was living on site at the asylum with them, and you put him to hard work. But yeah, when he was done, it was like, okay, well, you've built a beautiful fence here. Maybe it's time to find a job in the trades, and the guy goes and lives a productive life, afterwards. So, do you find sometimes though that it's actually harder to sell the adults on the positivity and the solution part of that when you say they come in tired and kind of exhausted and I've got a bad kid here? Do you ever find that it's a little bit tougher to flip them over to positive sides of things than the children, or is it kind of a group effort?
I'd say 50-50.
Yeah.
At least anecdotally 50-50. Like the ones that I can just tell they're done. Like they walk in, they just look defeated. They talk defeated. This is kind of their last resort. I usually try to spend a little bit more time with mom or dad or both, just to give them that little bit of, they need TLC too, right? They need that support. In Ohio, it's been great. Part of the Medicaid benefit includes therapy with family. So that's been a big plus to be able to do that, because that's encompassing at that point. But that work is, I would say once they realize that they're supported and then they get some validation for their feelings, like, yes, dealing with a child with behavioral problems sucks. Like it's real. Like anybody who's had a kid they've had a tantrum in the grocery store would know this, right? It's embarrassing. You get angry, but then you don't want to do anything about it because of what the onlookers are going to think about you. But now you have a child who does this, 3, 4, 5, maybe even 10 times a day. Like I can only imagine how exhausting that is.
Especially if you're a single parent, or there's not a lot of, so, you're working, you're trying to make this all balance out. I mean, even with both parents, it's tough enough, but they have a finite amount of emotional resources to throw at that. And then, a crazy person like me would sit there and go like, they'd say, well, he threw a 10-minute fit, and I'm like, I just want to get to the part where he got up off the floor and went to the car. Like, what happened then? Right. And they're like, no, you're letting them off the hook. Like, I want to talk about the 9 minutes and 59 seconds where he embarrassed me, where he wouldn't listen, where he, broke something in the store. And that's real. And you have to validate that for sure. But what are we after? We're after more of where he got control and work himself out. Yeah, I asked that question because I work with a lot of kids here in New Hampshire currently. And it's funny, we have some that the parents fall right into it. We had, one who the kid wouldn't stop running away. And the intervention got to be that when he ran away, instead of patrolling the streets, instead of calling his phone 5,000 times, instead of, take your 2 daughters out for ice cream, and it's sort of like, what? And I'm like, well, you're chasing your son all over the place, right? And they're not doing anything wrong. And what are they experiencing, right? And you've also kind of created a situation where things are good for everybody when everybody's kind of doing their part in the family. And so now when he comes home after that, which you're not finding him anyway. So the idea that like you're controlling that behavior by, you feel like you have to do something as a parent, right? And they look at you cross-eyed because like, what, just let my kid run the streets? Like, he's kind of already running the streets, But and again, it doesn't always work that way. But I've also had other families where we're working on temper tantrums and like the ice cream thing worked. That's a great story because then the kids started going like, well, if I leave, you guys are going to get ice cream and I don't want to miss out. So he stopped running away. It's like, yeah, got that one worked. But we've had others where it's like temper tantrums and we're like, okay, we want to celebrate the times that, she ended her temper tantrums and instead they're bringing in videos like, yeah, but look. And it's that investment in that problem is really tough to overcome. So what are some strategies that you employ with parents? I know you said supportive therapy and talking with them, but how do you help them throw that switch from asking what's wrong, like in this article, to focusing on like catching them doing the right thing, versus catching them doing the wrong thing? How do you approach that?
So it's going to depend on the family, but like a couple of the times, especially for the younger kids, I'll bring them in and I'll sit and we'll do play, right? We'll play and I'll get them to imitate, whether with the dolls or with the same. Like we got all types of crazy cool stuff at the office. But those as we're playing, when they start to escalate and, with the doll, oh, you're the worst teacher alive, blah, 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 I will implement a parenting technique. But it's going to be whatever it is, just a redirect and say, oh, okay, well, you know what? You seem really upset by that, but I bet you can't count every grain of sand in this box right now, right? Just a quick bam, don't even understand what's going on. They do it. And then when he does, oh my goodness, young man, I can't believe how amazing you are. Like you counted all these pieces of sand. Like, I don't even know how you did it. I didn't think it was possible, right? Building him up, show him he did what he was supposed to. Same concept you're showing, right? We're not trying to reward the high risk or negative behavior, but we can always reward those positive pieces. So when they start to see that, and then when the kid's like, oh, and he's all good about himself and he turns around to go play or something, I look at mom and dad and I'll say, this is what we're trying to accomplish.
Right. And then the aha moment,
Yeah.
those are nice when those happen. Do you feel like, I know you talked a little bit about some of the other approaches as far as motivational interviewing and things like that. I want to create some time if you want to talk about some of the adjacent, approaches or therapies to that. I mean, are you pretty strict with the solution focused approach? Do you use it in conjunction with other therapies? Do you weave in the motivational interviewing? And what's your typical style? I know every case is different, but what's the rhythm that you tend to fall into with that?
So kind of like flow wise, I would say we start out with a supportive. I do that pretty much pretty consistently. It's found it's the best practice to get that therapeutic alliance going. Because then when we start to make decisions about treatment, if we go solution focused, great. If we go CBT, DBT, a little bit more structure, if that's the type of person they are, that's what they're wanting to jump into, then it's awesome. But motivational interviewing, I love using it. One of my favorite techniques to use is that, and this is actually a great one for solution focus too, to help build motivation, is a decisional balance worksheet, which is the 4 quadrants. Our 4 quadrants. So what we would do is we would ask, you're going to do a pros and cons list. Everybody knows that. And this one always gets people if they've never done it. So like substance use is what it was primarily developed for. So if we use that as an example, what are the pros of not using? What are the pros of, or the cons of not using? And everybody's like, okay, they can run that one. But then when we flip it and go to that second column and say, what are the pros of using? Like, eyes just gonna like widen up. Like, I'm not allowed to talk about that. Like, it's taboo. But I promise you, right, there are pros to using. Typically, like friendships, you avoid emotions you don't want to worry about. You feel good for a moment or two or whatever. Like those are pros to recognize. But then you ask again the cons of using. And then so we start to see this balance that just starts to tilt or against using. But I'll use that like across the board, whether it's for like medication compliance, making a change in your life, even coming back to therapy. I've done that a couple of times. It wasn't too long ago, just a few months ago. I had a client who was pretty ambivalent about coming into therapy. So I was like, okay, well, let's talk about it, right? Is it something I'm doing? And so we would, hash that piece out and make sure it wasn't anything for me to adjust, or maybe a new therapist. And he said, no, it's not you. It's just, I just don't know that we're doing anything or that I'm going to get anything out of this. So we went back and forth with it.
I think that's powerful. I think that's, sorry to interrupt, but I think that's really powerful. That part right there about you checking in with him. Like, is it me? What would you change? You can always change a therapist. We were talking earlier on about how you deal with the hard caps in terms of payment, and things like that. And I think what's good about it, I see your arm, Ian, but I can't see your face. What are you trying to tell me? Say that again. I'm going to push Matt to 6:30. Yeah, or 6:15 or something like that. So yeah, you'll have to cut this part. So, well, yeah, no, it's all good. Yeah, Ian's a dynamic editor, so I'm sure we can lose this part. It's been great, but that's one thing I don't like about this. Since you're cutting this whole part, I don't like that I can't see you in this new setup. So we're gonna have to deal with that. I saw this arm behind this. Behind the TV. But no, so to get back on track, and you can pick it up here again, Ian. I don't know how to mark this for you, but this would be where we pick up. But what I think is really powerful about what you said is handing it back to them and handing the power to them to even evaluate you, to evaluate the approach. And when we were talking early on about the hard caps of managed care and people paying for services, and okay, you've got 10 and that's it. For me, the best way to communicate is often, right? So you're just checking in, and every 2 or 3 sessions, it's like, is this still working? Like, do you like this? Is this making, does this make sense? Are there other topics you'd want to focus on more? I like just handing that power over to them as much as possible, and I'm sure they really respond to that with you as well. So yeah. I was curious too, while we were sitting here talking, sorry to derail you there. I just thought that was such an important point to make. What do you do? Because I know now, a lot of your doctoral studies had to do with management and kind of leadership focused topics. You're in a position with where you train a lot of our staff, you monitor their ongoing development, you're there as a resource for them. What do you do as far as the solution focus or positive psych stuff when somebody comes in and they say, I'm CBT or I'm person centered or this is my style? Right? Do you make it a mandate? Are you kind of a soft sell? It's there if you need it. Like, how do you incorporate that into your training and staff development? I'm interested as far as that as well, because I think it is an excellent tool for everybody to have in the toolbox. But I wonder how you approach that with, is that something you're talking about day one or as they develop? How do you approach that with new staff?
Yeah, so we're typically at interview. I'm asking about modalities and where they're at. No, most everybody comes out, right? CBT. Every so often I get some extra pieces. But tell them, we are strength based. That's where we want to keep our foundation at. But using those modalities is, I want to allow that autonomy to the therapist because I think that's fair to them. Like you said, it's a hard art. Right? I love that term. I actually used it a few weeks ago. I listened to a previous podcast where he said, I was like, oh, this is going to go great for some training. But it really is. And so each person needs to be able to express that the way that they need to. So we talk about solution focus, or even just the strength space. I typically talk about like my approach and like my timeline to, therapy. So if we look at like a 16-week model, first couple of weeks supportive therapy, maybe a few weeks of MI, just depending on what's going on with the client, and then we'll jump into that heavy piece of solution focused or CBT or DBT, trauma focused stuff if that's what's needed. And so we allow that autonomy, but still have some structure that's in place for the client or for the therapist.
Have you found any pieces of this, either execution or mindset wise, that other therapists tend to struggle with, from a developmental standpoint or a training standpoint, or do you think people take to it pretty well? What's been your experience there?
I think everybody takes to it pretty well. Like even bachelor's level individuals are coming in and they're learning about strength space and solution focus. But as we talk about that balance of pushing your agenda, they tend to think of it like, oh, I'm a therapist, so I'm just going to start making suggestions and solution focus, which is then when you start getting, why don't you do this? Yes, but, right? You're going to keep getting those little, and you're like, well, I don't understand. They just don't want to do anything I'm suggesting to them. Well, it's because it's your suggestion. You tell anybody you should do something, they're going to do the exact opposite.
Right. Yeah. I think about some of the behavioral and kind of like, personality disorder stuff and getting an oppositional defiant client in and going, why is he not taking my suggestions? Like, well, that's the part of the situation, So I think anytime it's somebody's idea versus an idea given to them, that's a little bit better. The flip side of that, though, to be straight about it, like a lot of times clients will come in wanting answers really fast. And I know I've encountered some frustration where it's sort of like, they wouldn't say it in these terms, but stop handing it back to me, right? Like I need you to guide me. What barriers do you see on the client side and how do you work with those?
That's usually, if you have somebody that's coming in, it's a little bit more direct that way. I'm going to flip to something probably more structured. And so we're going to use something like a CBT and just kind of follow that mapping. That way we're not, they're feeling, the clients who I've seen personally that don't do well with like just straight solution focus and going back and going back and going back are ones who are a little bit more linear type, right? Like, let's get some stuff done. I need tangibles. I need something to walk away with here or from here with. So that CBT model tends to go, right? So there's always a psychoeducation piece every session if you follow like the fidelity. Because you'll start off the cognitive model, they'll learn that, right? If you old school cognitive model, ABC, right? Activating behavioral consequences. It's changed, obviously, but those are, just getting through it quickly. But going from there to cognitive distortions and learning that cognitive processing. You can do some of this stuff too, even with the solution focus. So if somebody's coming to you, you don't have to jump full blown, but bringing those in and helping them identify those cognitive distortions can be a big one. So if you're always hearing those, well, everybody, and this always, and these, black and white type thinking, we can educate on that and say, okay, well, we need to reframe those because we're missing some of that. How does that sound to you? Here's a worksheet. Here's this. Are you willing to do this? Kind of like giving critiquing as well. If there's a point where I need to give a suggestion, or they're just, just something's happening, where they're just blocked, I'll kind of ask, hey, are you ready for a suggestion? Or are you open to a professional suggestion or however, and just allow them to say yes or no. And if they are, great. And if they're not, then okay, no big deal. Carry on.
Yep. No, that's nice. Yeah. We're going to have to do it. We're going to have to find somebody to come in and go through the ABCs with us. I'd forgotten about that a little bit, but I'm gonna see if I can get it right. So A is your activating event, right? And B is your belief about that event. At least this is what I remember. So C is the consequences of that belief. All right. D is your disputing notion, the effect of the dispute, and then the final outcome or final change. At least that's what I remember. But yeah, so I love that piece, and I hadn't used the ABC in a minute. We got to find somebody, maybe it's you or somebody come in and really hammer on that, because I just love that so much, your belief about the event. The only thing that changes in the whole scenario, right, is your belief about that. And that's where I think you do in an indirect way with solution focused. Back to the substance abuse issue, I went to treatment and I still kept on using is a whole, that's reinforcing that belief of me as a failure, as a loser. And, losers are going to find a way to lose. You're going to prove yourself right, period. Versus, wait, you're telling me out of the last 90 days, you only used once? Like, wow, why didn't you use more? That kind of disruptive thought of like, what are you asking me? But then when they really dig into it, like, well, because I value my family, because I used my, coping skills that I developed in recovery, because I have a new way of living, because what used to be 6 weeks on a run is now 6 hours with a bad thought in my head. And then I can get back on track. And there's a lot of success to harvest there. And all that changes is your belief about the activating event, your belief about the trigger, right? So that's amazing. Yeah, thank you for refreshing me on that, because they're all in there. They're all in the toolbox. It's just what you bring out. So talking on the flip side of this, right? Because sometimes I think whenever we talk about solution focus or positive psych, some of the feedback is like, well, that seems too easy, or it seems like it works for everything. Have you hit any hard limits? Have you hit any diagnoses or situations where like, whoa, this is just not a fit? Like, what limitations have you found to the approach, or what experiences have you had where I'm like, I need something different here or something more,
Yeah. So, I mean, technically, like solution focus there is fairly similar as far as like the CBT model, right? Everybody studies it. It always shows some, significant enough effectiveness.
Better than not talking to them at all. Yes.
Pretty much. Yeah. So that's where it becomes, soft science.
Soft science, hard arts. Yeah.
Yeah.
Measure it.
Yeah. So as far as like the work that I do or have done, I'd say probably trauma stuff. Like, I'm not going to be there like, so when's the last time you were able to get through a trauma successfully? Like those types of things don't always come through, and it's hard to equate. Don't mean to like take this down a real dark road, but I can't equate, a rape to a stressful time in your life, because those are scale. Sorry, I'm holding my.
No, it's good. It's video, man. This is a big time podcast. Yeah. This is not just audio. You can talk with your hands here.
That's right. Yeah. But stress levels on that, right? Like your daily, I was stressed because of a test might be a 4 or 5, but me thinking about that rate puts me at an 8 or 9. And so like, well, how did you overcome that 3, 4 level? It doesn't compute the same. Because I could, an easy minor, maybe mindfulness practice or deep breathing or just reading a book will get you out of that little funk there. It's not going to work up here.
Well, and you'd mentioned that you're trauma trained, so not to take it too far the other direction, but what would you do in those situations where you're dealing with sexual assault or sexual abuse or abuse in general, more of those, quantifiable, truly traumatic experiences? Where would you go with that? And, what does your training tell you to do with that?
I'd work them through those protocols. So just depending on what it is, there's some CBT that's a part of that. So there's a lot of psychoeducation, kind of learning about it. But then also like experiential type therapy. So reliving it, whether it's through verbally speaking it, writing it, recording yourself saying it, and listening back to it. But a lot of it would be like a lot of the emotional regulation piece too, and learning those before we get to the experiential, right? Because that's where you always hear, right? I opened them up but didn't close them, right? And now they're freaking out and running down the road naked because, well, you did something really ridiculous.
They're bleeding. Yeah, they're bleeding. Yeah, you ripped the stitches out. Yeah.
And they didn't have the tools to do it. That's why they're coming to see you in the first place. So educating, working on those processes, not neuro mapping, but brain change type stuff. So really working, trying to get you from down here to right here. So that way you're, when those moments do arise, you can start to think, okay, I can reconnect and I can bring myself back to my body if you're dissociating or if you are heightened. So you have a startle, heart racing, whatever. So we're going to start doing that deep breathing, polyvagal type theories or therapy type stuff. So,
yeah, I think back to the early days of my career, and I started working in a facility, and there was an old timer, and she left group, and she's like, "Yeah, I knew it was a good group because I really got them all crying." And if they're not crying, they're not working, she'd like say that. And I'm just kind of like wide eyed and brand new. And I'm just like, oh, okay. And just kind of thinking about that. And I think about it now and I just shudder, like, the damage that you can do there. A lot of it is go slow, shrink the change, do less, it's just like smaller bites. But at the time, like you said, back to the way it's portrayed in the movies and the media, it's all catharsis, it's all breakdown, it's all, oh my gosh, I just finally realized. And then, they scream and yell and then it's all better, but that's not how it goes. People can get hurt behind us.
You have to talk about it.
You have to.
Like that was, a group that I was working with, somebody else, we were working with another agency and they brought in somebody who said that they were trauma trained, but really they just read a book.
Right.
Right. And so I walked into this group about an hour afterwards. They're screaming at each other. They're yelling. I mean, I was like, what in the world is going on?
Good group.
No. It was.
That's what she'd say.
That's pretty much how it kind of went. And I was like, no. And then I was like, hey, so I talked to the one lady who was in the corner, a little bit more isolated. And I was like, you okay? What's going on here? Why is everybody just a mess? And because she was one that was typically a little more level-headed, a little more emotionally regulated. And after I said that, just pop, like, I'm sorry about this, but she just basically said, that bitch over there made us all talk about our trauma, all in the same group, right? Like, I was like, okay, what'd you guys do after? And she said, nothing, that was it. And then we just started yelling at each other. I was like,
of course.
Okay.
And the scary word in that is not the word bitch, is the word maid. right?
Yeah.
Made us. So now I've taken all your power. There's no choice, and and we're going to do this, and we're going to get gut level honest with ourselves today, because I woke up full of energy and decided today's the day. I'll share a story. So when I was young, working on a residential unit, adolescence, and with same sort of thing. Had a kid, a lot of trauma. I won't give any kind of identifying details, obviously, but got up there one night kind of late. My schedule allowed it, and so we really got working. And I was inexperienced, and I felt like, okay, he's going, so I'm going to keep going. And when you first get out, you're like, I've got all the training, I can handle anything, and I'll just I'll run towards the fire, not away from it. It felt courageous, and it felt like I'm going to do what others wouldn't. And so we do all this stuff, and obviously the aftercare wasn't there. Obviously we went too far too fast. But when he left the session, I felt like, wow, his life is going to change. This was the moment. And I'm writing my note up like if I could have used all capital letters, I would have. And then I did that. And before I leave, I'm walking off the unit, and he says, "Hey, I gotta show you something." And he had gone to his bathroom, and had his arm from here to here, and just opened up. It just like the skin just kind of flayed open. So he had engaged in obviously some serious self-harm. Not a full-on attempt, not a full suicidal attempt, because that was the first question. Like, was that your intent? And he goes, no, I was feeling all this. I needed to feel something else. I didn't know how to get that turned off. And that was my inexperience at that time, not being able to help him get that turned off. We'd gone too far, too fast. So all medical interventions, the story ends great. That's why I'm willing to share it, because, he's fine to this day. And it turned out fine, a successful treatment episode, obviously some medical intervention in the middle there, but that's that going too far, too fast and allowing them. And I just think that, there may have been some limits there, right? So if I just hit with, wow, and you're still, standing after all that, that's probably insufficient for what we were dealing with in that moment, So taking measured steps. So since we're getting into the good stuff, I guess, and you were talking about all the trauma, what about the use of positive psychology, solution-focused techniques with people who are suicidal, having suicidal ideation or past attempts? Have you had any success there, or do you feel like that's one of those limitations?
I have, especially during like safety planning and working through stuff. We're trying to divert from going to the ER or going and maintaining their safety while staying in the community. Have you had suicidal thoughts before? Okay, you have, great. You're obviously still here, so you showed me, you're able to work through that. How did you work through it? And so that's it's definitely applicable there. It's not always going to be the case, because once we start pulling into plan and intent and planning the plan, like then we're getting into a little bit more dangerous territory. But
yeah, and I think it's again, it's an artistic choice. But sometimes around that, because that's one of those really scary topics, and everybody goes into like, okay, do you have the means? Do you intend to act? All the questions that you should ask and are good to ask. But then beyond that, it's like, okay, what do we do with this? And I've heard people coming from a solution-focused perspective literally ask, well, if you've had past attempts, why didn't you follow through? And it's sort of a gasp kind of moment, like, whoa, are you baiting them into it? But I actually think some really positive stuff came out of that, because they're exploring their resiliency, they're exploring the reasons for choosing differently. And so, I think, with all the fun talk about therapy, understanding that we encounter some pretty serious stuff from time to time. And the fact that they appeared for their session, even if it's not a suicidal or a traumatic deal, I'm struggling to the point where I need to reach out for help. It's been a week since I made my appointment. I'm here. That's a win, right? I had a suicidal attempt. I didn't die. I backed off, maybe I just engaged in self-harm, didn't go all the way with it. So I made that choice for life. Like, that's a win. Like, I'm here, your presence is evidence, in those cases. And we need to investigate that as much as we investigate what got you to that dark place in the first place,
Yeah. So I have something maybe for you too, just as you're working, you talk about like the self-harm, and typically we think children, adolescents tend to have that. And I know you have a lot of experience with that. How do you work solution focused into that, or strengths based? Because that is a coping skill, right? Like, I'm not going to tell somebody who's cutting to cope versus cutting to kill to not do it early on, because they're obviously working through something.
Yeah. So for me, in those cases, I think the number one thing is and this is where you have to be a little bit of an actor, is to pull the shame and the guilt off of that as quick as possible. One of my kind of core beliefs is that all behavior is communication. And so to me, it's more about externalizing that and saying like, okay, what is this scar saying? Like, what is it? What are you telling the world or the people around you with this, right? And so more of it's really, I'm always looking for a solution fast to get them on that track of thinking about their capabilities versus their deficits. And so my first response in that moment would be to go, how did that's impressive that you felt brave enough to reveal that to me. Like, how did we get to a place where you felt that you could muster that courage? Because I've worked with a lot of clients who have kept that secret from everybody, right? So there's a little bit of normalizing. I've worked with a lot of clients who have done that. You're not weird. You're not strange. Everybody has felt this. I want to know what I'm externalizing. I want to know what those scars are saying, not what your soul, your spirit, your internal, what's wrong with you. It's like, no, what are you trying to say? And then how did you muster the courage or the strength? You can always go to the strength, right? And one of the common compliments that gets interpreted as a compliment that's very low risk is like, it really says a lot about you that you were able to show me this. What do you want to do with this? And where do we go from here? So I don't know if that's a perfect answer, but that's sort of my approach to it. It's like, you got to find something to compliment really quick, because otherwise here's the deep, dark secret. And now we're going to spiral down. I think that's when people get really invested in how broken they are and other labels they may have assigned to themselves or that people have assigned them. Somebody at school sees their scars and calls them a freak or a weirdo or you're goth or you're, blah, blah, blah. It was some kind of other horrible. And I'm just really trying to activate really quickly to make sure that those labels don't get internalized. And so I want to pull it on the outside, what is it saying about this? And then, wow, you actually are really strong, because there's a lot of kids, they probably know kids that are hiding it to that day. There's a lot of kids that are hiding that, would never summon the courage to do something about it and actually get real about their situation. Before we get into that, and we will, tell me about how you were able to be so strong, because they may feel weak. I broke down, I gave in, I'm weak, I can't, I hurt myself. No, I actually see a lot of strength there because you're doing something about it and not letting that win. So how are we able to summon that strength? So, and so it doesn't always work, right? I mean, someone can get that exact same series of questions and go, dude, you're not even listening. Like, you're missing the entire point. Like, no, I'm hurt and I've got a big problem. I want to talk about this problem. And then probably a lot like you mentioned before, like, okay, then we're going to go with your idea and tell me what you want me to know about that, So, but it's scary. And especially for newer therapists and things like that, the idea of that, and part of the training, and rightfully so, is around this idea of like, these are vulnerable clients and at any moment, but it's not diffusing a bomb. There's not anything that Dr. Casey Montoya, unless you're actively engaged in trying to hurt a client. If you're going in there with the do no harm, try to do some good, you're not going to clip the wrong cord and send them out that way. They're already out there. You're going to help bring them back, So I think getting past that fear is tough.
No, it is. Any of those crisis things, they're scary for anybody. Even because I get those calls, right? Like therapist has something go on. I'm the one who goes on the documentation of, and I spoke to my supervisor to confirm. So I'm the last person on that note, that's part of why I did what I've, gone through and did all the work that I have. So it's that is always going to be scary, but if kind of like your own internal protocols and having those pieces, and you can train appropriately and effectively so that you can get the information up front. And that can be hard. Because if you freak out in that moment, like, oh my gosh, my client's suicidal, right? Like where I was working previously, I was talking to a colleague in a hallway, and we just hear help, and like full sprint, somebody comes running around the corner, won't say anything about them, but knees to chest, full sprint, heading down. Oh, the supervisor, come here. So, what's going on? I'm using the form and they said they're suicidal. Oh, okay. What'd they say? They have a plan, intent? I didn't ask those questions. Like, didn't even get to the question.
Fire alarm, pull, help. Yeah. And it is scary. I don't want to water it down. I don't want to. I mean, those are sometimes life or death situations. But like a paramedic who shows up and administers CPR, if it doesn't work, you did not cause that person's demise. You do your best effort in the moment. But there's a million different ways, and that's where the artistry comes in, because somebody else could do the exact same thing and it fails. Somebody else, different tone. I talked about Milton Erickson before. He's got another great story where a patient tried to stab him in an elevator, and he pulled out the knife, and he instantly got into complimenting him about, well, hold on, you're right-handed, right? Like, and you already had it stashed in your pocket. Like, hold on, you've been dealing with all of these mental challenges, yet you had the foresight to have that in your right pocket, knowing you were right-handed. How did you plan this so well? We've been trying to get you to plan your day, and then and like all Milton Erickson stories, they end with him, the superhero. But you buy time. Like, time is your big factor. Like, how do we make sure it's not happening right now? Slow it down, shrink the change, and his story ends with, but they got to the door and then security's there and they can help. And sometimes it is that level of intervention. But, if it's, oh my gosh, and panic, I mean, that is the part where we do have to be the professionals in that moment. And, if we're panicking right along with them, I don't know what positive outcome is going to come from that, So we're a little short on time. I do want to wrap, but I wanted to ask you first. I mean, we'll have you on again next week while we're out, and I appreciate your time and coming on and your expertise on this. I feel like it's even just piecing through some of the acronyms and the different modalities. I feel like we could do another 3 or 4 hours, no problem, and maybe we will. So one thing I did want to ask you though, for people who are listening. As I was doing my research for this, I got into some Reddit threads and things like that, which are always like really, hit or miss. But they were literally asking some important questions about, how do I know if solution-focused therapy is working? My therapist says she's solution-focused, but I'm not feeling much better. Or even some questions around like, how do I know which type of therapist to select, right? So I think there were a lot of questions in there. And then, of course, there was people who didn't know giving answers. And so it was just like this cluster of like bad advice and some nuggets in there. But I wanted to give that to you. So 2 questions, I guess, is one, when should a person be thinking about requesting a solution-focused therapist or a positive, psychiatric approach or psychology approach? So when if you're a client, when should you be thinking down those lines? And then if you do get involved with a solution-focused therapist or a positive psychology approach, how should they measure their progress and determine whether it's quote unquote working for them?
So choosing or when to choose. Similar to CBT, we talked a little bit about it, but the evidence is open, so it is effective. So I mean, you could come out right away and just say, I want to find this solution-focused person. I would say probably trying to find individuals who have strength-based versus straight solution-focused. Because if that's it, then if you're putting that on there and that's the only thing, like you go on to Counseling Today or any of those websites to try to find a therapist and they have solution-focused, but you don't see anything else, they might not be able to switch you, right? To be able to be eclectic and flip over to that next one. But you can absolutely reach out and request it and try it. You would need to work with them and ask them to scale you. And so to work on an evaluation. So this could be based off of the medical model that we've been talking about. So you're going to have to do what's called like a PHQ-9 or depressive scale, or maybe a GAD-7, which is for anxiety. Or whatever your problem is, your diagnosed problem. But you can also take into account, and you can do your own scaling, and you can journal and pay attention to the activities that you're doing and how you're feeling about those activities. Because solution focused, your focus may not just be on your depression. It may be on, I'm not getting out of bed. I'm not sleeping well. I'm not doing the things that I used to like to do. I'm crying a lot. But if you're journaling about those things, then you'll be able to scale those and go back and be like, I had a journal entry where I talked about how sad I was 3 weeks ago. And then 2 days ago, I had this journal entry that talked about how wonderful, life is feeling right now. Like, that's a stark contrast.
I think one of the, I've worked at several substance abuse facilities, and something that we never did that I always thought we should, and maybe someday I will, you never know. But I always think it'd be great to have people's first assessments videotaped, right? So the day one you're in, literally just have it taped. Because I just think there's a million opportunities down the road where you feel like nothing's changing. I mean, it's not losing weight. You can't just go look at the scale, right? It's not, running faster. It's not a broken bone. You can't look at an x-ray. And so with mental health on a continuum, you can be doing better overall, but feel really crappy on a given day, because that's what doing better looks like. You have your ups and your downs and you don't break down, along that continuum. But I always thought that'd be very powerful to be able to look back in time and see yourself, at that starting point and then be like, now watch this person and tell me you're not doing better as your eyes are brighter, your skin is clear, you're sitting up, you're talking more knowledgeably about your situation, versus that day one person who's, hunched over and crying every 3 seconds, wearing a hoodie and, maybe not taking care of themselves physically and, just the way that people present, soft-spoken and all those kinds of things. I don't know. I just think that reflective would be really nice. And journaling is really powerful. I think the daily effort that takes is really powerful, but I just like that snapshot in time effect where you're like, I'm out of here. This isn't working. Like, cool. You can absolutely leave. Before you go, I want you to meet somebody. Meet you the day you got here. I wonder how many people would actually leave after that, some still it wouldn't cure it, but
no, but that's still enough. That's a really cool, because there is not just substance use, but I'm thinking about like mental health, right? The pieces that don't happen when you're going through a major depressive episode. And if you saw a picture of yourself back then, because we see the ones for substance use, right? When I was on meth, I was 45 pounds and this and this and this, and now I've gained it all back and I'm healthy and my skin's cleared up. But you still do see physical changes. So like all the somatic symptoms from anxiety or trauma, right? Like you're always wary. You see like vets before and after they go, but you don't see the vet from when they come back to when after they have treatment. And if somebody's worked with a few vets, like I can visibly see differences in them and even their stature and how they present themselves. Like that's.
You've done enough sessions where you could probably re-diagnose somebody walking up to the office at this point, right? Like the way they come through the door, you sit down and you let them tell their story, but they're telling their story every step coming in. And then the dark side of that too, the flip side, you've probably done this enough, not with 100% accuracy, but the way they come in on day one, you can almost get to a piece of a part of a diagnosis, watching the body language, the eye movement, how they're carrying themselves. Yeah, exactly. Yep. Or even then people have talked about like the look in their eyes, right? Like I knew I was dealing with a bipolar. I knew I was dealing with, but then you obviously take the steps and you do those assessments, like you said, and you get the data and use psychiatry and things like that. So, Dr. Montoya, I appreciate it. I'm gonna wrap up here. Like I said, I feel like we could go, but I know you're taking time away from your family to do this, and so no, I appreciate it so much. Any something I didn't ask, or any final parting thoughts related to solution focus and positive psych? I mean, stuff you want therapists to think about, or any final contribution before we cut you loose?
I don't think so. I'd say maybe for therapists would be something like, allowing yourself to be eclectic and be open and to be an artist, right? If we continue down that path of that theme, I think that makes a big difference between good and great therapists.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Jim Collins there for you to wrap it up. Going from good to great is being able to add that solution focused piece, because one thing we didn't make time to cover, but I think it works great in conjunction with almost every other type of therapy, because all therapies are trying to do good. And so, you try to take the CBT as an anchor or as an outline for that. And then as you're working through your cognitive distortions, you notice they went from 17 occurrences to 12, and to be able to stop and go, wow, how did you do that? That is a huge difference. That's not 5. That is, 33%, a little bit less. But, so hold on, we've only been working together a week and you're already like 30% down in this. I need to know how you did that. And then you can get back to your worksheet, and then you can, I just think it really colors between the lines really well and helps blend that stuff together. And it just plays nice with all those other modalities for sure. So, all right. I appreciate you, Dr. Montoya. Thank you so much for the time. Wrapping up for you guys at home, watching this, listening, however you're listening, I appreciate your time as well. Hopefully your life got a little bit better. You learned a little something there. And then just a final shout out, to our producer Ian. You can't see him. We're going to put him on camera here pretty soon. He is just devastatingly handsome guy. And I think it's really unfair of us to like hold him back from the world, but we're going to get him on camera, but we appreciate his great work. Thank you, Ian, so much. And then to A New Behavioral Health, our sponsor. Again, if you're looking for help, if you're somebody who has a loved one who could use some help either on the substance abuse side, mental health, and you live anywhere in New Hampshire or Ohio, don't be stuck. If we don't have an office down the street, telehealth is an amazing thing. We have folks who work 7 days a week. We are an eclectic group that we're kind of rooted in positive psychology, but if you need CBT, whatever issue you're working on, we have a therapist for you. I promise we'll find a good match. Dr. Montoya will probably be the person making that match, so you know you're in good hands there. But you can check us out at ANEWBH.com. There's a lot of connect with us, find us, links there, and we'd be honored to serve and honored to help you out. So until next time, again, thank you so much, Dr. Montoya. And for those of you watching, remember, take care of yourself and take care of each other. Appreciate it.